Welcome to Culture We. Today we're going to talk about the books, podcasts, movies, and TV shows that are making us think about culture and that we have fallen in love with and want to share with others.
Okay. Set that for you starting.
Yes, I can start. I had the book with me.
What book is
Not that you can read it because it's in Swedish.
Until All?
Yeah, tills alla där.
Yes.
Until all dies. Yeah, something like that.
Oh, we're going dark.
I know. And I never really read Swedish books. I don't really like reading them for some reason. Especially if they're translated, then I'd rather read in English or whatever. But this one was suggested to me by actually Chris, our mutual friend, which is it's like a Swedish book. But then he suggested it to me. I was like, oh, okay.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think he read it translated, I guess. And it's really good. It's nicely I like the writing style because I like the style of when you write something, but you also use past, future, and present tense and stuff when they explain something of for example, and they didn't know that this was gonna get worse or whatever. It becomes more ominous in some way.
So what's the full book title and who wrote it?
So Tills alla dör, and it's translated roughly, I guess, to Until Everyone Dies. And it's by Diamant Salihud.
Okay.
It's about the gang violence in Sweden, which has gotten a lot worse this decade, I guess. But also recently, it keeps getting worse and worse. And usually when you hear it, mostly on the news, it's always someone got shot again because it's something happening every day. But you don't really get a lot of information or a lot of perspective into these issues, mostly also at the beginning or what cops are doing. But this is very nice because he's done years of research, and he has put all these notes and all the interviews he's done into this book. You get both the gang members' perspective, but also people that know people that are in gangs. He's interviewed them. He's interviewed cops, so you get very much this perspective from a lot of different views. And what's interesting, and what's interesting is actually given a beginning to how this started, which you don't really hear at all. I didn't know at least a theory or whatever of how all this could have started, because we just always living in this constant that you don't really think that might have started somehow.
Yeah, that there's some bigger societal context as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it gives a lot of context to things, and I think it helps as well to think deeper, I guess, because you always think that it's just oh, another person dead. You kind of get desensitized somehow as well. So I think it helps to hear from them, because he talks about, because all of these are children, they're teenagers, most of them, which is even worse. So it could be 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds. They're sitting here do you have nothing else to do? Come on, where are you running around with a gun shooting other people? Or mostly drugs or stuff like that as well. So it kind of gives the perspective from these people, and you kind of feel more connected to them somehow, that because he'll start talking about a boy's story, for example, in the book, and then that guy grows up and ends up dying. So you kind of feel more connected to them, because it's not just that you hear them dying, it's about their story as well, and that maybe they were great at football, for example, and they loved playing, but they didn't have the resources, or their parents worked 3 jobs, so they couldn't take them anywhere. So they had to drop out, and then they had a lot of free time and they started hanging out with the other guys and stuff like that. It kind of starts mostly like that, sadly, that most of the time the guys just don't have anything to do, and then they start hanging with other guys that don't have anything to do, and it just escalates from there.
Yeah, and there's a safety aspect. It sounds very like the research I've read or the stories that have been done on American gang culture, and there's just this need for positive role models, good things to be doing, but also safety and perspective of, yes, I can get out of here.
Yeah,
exactly. So it's really sad that the book also mentions some of the people do want to get out, but it's really hard. They can't. There are apparently like organizations that help gang members get out. And I think he wrote about one guy that applied for the organization, but they had denied his application. So he couldn't get help to get out of the gang, even if he tried.
For
and
what
I think
reason?
I don't know. I don't think he said, but I think a lot of time it's about resources that organizations don't like. There's so many that need help that you, sadly enough, can't always help everyone. And I think that's very sad. But one interesting thing that the book mentioned is looking into like Swedish rap is a very big thing. That most of these people creates music as well, which is this very specific genre of Swedish rap that they use like other languages and stuff as well, that I've talked about with like the language, where they like bring in other languages such as like Arabic or Turkish. And so one of the things he analyzes is the lyrics of these songs. And I knew that most of these people were probably like criminals in some shape or form, or like were into these gangs, but I didn't think the level of how much it actually was. I've listened to many of these songs, but you don't really think or listen to the actual words they're saying. So you're just like, oh, it's a nice beat. And you just listen. Right. You don't really know what it's about, which is really bad, because one day they're going to be like, that's a really bad song. So he like analyzes the words, and it has so many messages between these gangs. Like it will be messages to the different gangs from different gangs. And they'll use, a lot of these people have nicknames within gangs, so they don't use their real names. And they use the nicknames and say like, oh, you shot this person, or you did this and you killed this person and stuff like that in the song, which was insane. And then I went in and listened as well. And then I kept hearing it like everywhere. All these messages like literally out in the open, talking about how they shot this guy in the apartment building or whatever. They throwing hate at each other. They're really using it as like a messaging tool between and like throwing hate.
That's also a thing in American gang culture, right?
Yeah,
it's a very...
He does mention that as well.
I think of like growing up in like the early 90s, like obviously looking back at it now, I have a lot more understanding, and just like there's so much to learn. But I think of like the biggest one you think of is like Biggie Smalls and Tupac. And
yeah, exactly.
And definitely, nowadays it's like Eminem and MGK, throwing stuff back and forth, but it wasn't necessarily as living in Compton or living in the Bronx, or actually coming up from the streets and having lived in certain areas and having actually lived that life. Nowadays it's not as certain ones, certain rappers and such have experienced that life, but not necessarily as it was in those earths.
I think the big problem I have with these songs is that they over glorify criminality a lot. That like even their music videos, which I never watch deliberately, because they have money, they have guns, like women, drugs, and that's what they'll show and sing about all the time. And a lot of like girls and boys like look up to these people. I think it's just really sad that they don't really see the problem, and that a lot of these guys that do make music are in the gangs most of the time, or connected to it somehow, and that they're not really good people in that sense. And I think they had
where it's like, did they have a choice?
Yeah, no, like I'll say that some of these people who are making these music are deliberately in these gangs. They have the space here to make music and earn money in this way, and actually have a good space to do it, because they also earn money through that. It's sad that they're not using this in a better way, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of a catch-22 of maybe they have become famous enough or successful enough in that music realm, but they became it by talking about their truth and their reality. And if that reality changes, if they leave the gang, or say if they're even allowed to leave the gang, where does that audience go? I guess, how do they respond to it? If you're going to be rapping about a different life that you're living, it would be a different kind of music, and maybe they fear losing that notoriety in that.
Yeah, I think for me, like the difference is that there are people that sing about the life, the hard life that they've lived as a criminal in a educating way. So there's music that I think one does that, at least he has a song that he sings that it's like, it's really rough, that this is not something you'd want, like it's not a good life and stuff like that. But then the majority sings it as a good thing, like they over glorified it. It's nice, it's, you get the money, you get the girls, whatever. So I think that is the difference for me, that you can use this for a good thing. Like, you have lived a rough life, absolutely, there are people that didn't have a choice. And also it's a lot of examples in the book as well where people don't always have a choice, and that maybe their friend got shot and they had to like do something about it. But I think that the difference for me is that, are you trying to recruit people into these gangs with your songs or music by over glorifying it, or are you trying to teach the young people? Because it's kind of like an epidemic right now. Like, there's so many young girls and guys that are in these gangs. I don't know if they think it's like an easy life.
Looking back at like the 90s, 80s, whatever, when you have social media and that connectability to show off, what we already know of is fake on Instagram, this like baddie lifestyle or gangster lifestyle, whatever it is, or just a wealthy lifestyle, doesn't even have to be criminality wise. It's so easy to fake it and make it look even better. When you think back of the 90s, it's like at the very beginning of the cycle of like 24-hour news cycle. And so it's like, you're really only getting out on the nightly news. People that are joining and wanting to go are already in, or having to go already in those neighborhoods. It's not necessarily like this recruitment tool, which is interesting in a different aspect.
The book says as well that it's mostly it's called Järvaområdet, which is like around Tensta, Rinkeby and stuff, like the suburbs of Stockholm, which is kind of, I think, like Bronx, Hampton, the examples you gave of like there's very deep, like that's where they say it kind of started this, because he talks about how it started with like a couple of best friends. Like that's how it started. Like they were best friends. They lived in that area, like in Rinkeby, since they were children. And then a couple of things happened and they started shooting, like they killed each other. And so these people like that were friends of some of these people, like one of the guys that died and were friends with one of the guys that died, like came together and then they started killing each other. So he talks about how before all this, criminality of it was like really small. It was like stealing a bit or like whatever, like it wasn't that big of a thing. This was like a catalyst to having criminality between these young people being more than just like stealing. They were like, oh, now we can do bigger stuff. We can kill people, we can sell drugs or whatever. And it became like bigger and bigger. So it's become like this uncontrollable thing that like changed everything, kind of, is how he describes it. So
does he talk about like the social context of it, of maybe being in a segregated neighborhood, not having well-funded schools, like for our gang violence and such, and neighborhoods that are in need, and it's just this vicious cycle of you can't get out and they're targeted, just creates this domino effect basically.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like these are more like rougher areas or whatever you say, and usually the schools are not as good. They don't have as much resources. I mean, there's a limit to what teachers can do as well. Some of the guys he talks about wouldn't show up to school, for example. There was one example he gave that the teacher literally came to his house and pulled him to school because he needs to be there, because otherwise he's somewhere else doing something bad. And like that is like not something teachers get paid for, definitely not in those areas. And even though they should get paid more because they do so much more for the students, and it's still like if they don't want to be helped as well, it's really hard. Also, like resources is not as much given to those areas maybe as they should, for example. I don't know, it's just really hard. And I think it's the same with like to change principals, for example, because like it's so hard. People like can't work there for very long. I think it's like
the burnout would be incredible.
Yeah, exactly. I think it really is. And there is this like silent culture in these areas where they don't really talk to cops, for example. It's a very big thing that they're like, they won't say anything. And then cops like he talks about that as well, of like, if they don't talk to us, then we can't really help them either, because there isn't much we can do if we don't have witnesses, for example. Like there might be people that see stuff, but they won't say anything at all. He talks about like how cops said that like they've never seen anything like this in other places, of like not saying anything at all. They say like we can't get people to talk, like they won't say anything.
I wonder, because one of the podcasts I'll mention, they talk about that in the First Nations communities in Canada, and that level of silence. But it's because of the history of targeting and just malicious, policing, basically, unfortunately, in those areas. And that's led to it. But I don't know, did he find that of like they had been targeted, they had experienced racism or prejudice or whatnot, of like why it would shut down that level of communication?
Yeah, he doesn't say it in that sense, but he does say that they're worried that they'll get killed or their children will be killed, because it's such a constant thing, especially in those areas, that they'll find like there are people dying all the time, and they're just like, we can't risk that. And there was one year when it got really bad with all these killings, and because these kids, I'll say kids because they were really like teenagers, knew each other so well, their parents knew each other, like they were all friends. That's why it's so much rougher. And there was one point where, because the cops couldn't do that much or didn't do that much, that all the families, like all the parents around this area, came together. I think it was in a mosque, and they started talking on what to do. It was one of the biggest gatherings, I think, of all parents, and trying to see what they can do. Yeah, one of the, I think, solutions was that they had buried the two guys that were killed, that started being against each other. They buried them next to each other as a message of like, this should end. They were friends, they were childhood friends, this should like end. So they had buried them next to each other, apparently. Like it was one of the choices they made. But well, obviously that did not help, at least not between the teenagers.
So the author, does he give his background, what community he's from and such?
Oh, it was a while ago. But no, but I mean, he does say he's like a journalist and stuff, and he's worked like for that for a very long time. But I don't know if he said anything about like his cultural background.
So I like wonder if he's from those communities, or if he is culturally, in those same areas, or is he from a wealthy Swedish neighborhood? And
yeah, I mean,
I always wonder where people come
from. No, I mean, I think it's of course important, but I still think he's done like very good work, and he's gotten like a lot of recognition for that, because it's really deeply, like, he's investigated it for a very long time and has done so many interviews with so many people that got out of gangs, parents that lost people in gang violence and stuff. And it's very nice. It's really heavy, so I haven't I took a very long pause, like in the book, and I just couldn't return to it. So I haven't even finished it, and it's been so long. Like I'm like right in the
Halfway.
middle.
You're right in the middle.
Yeah, I took a pause because he'll start talking about a guy, and then he dies, like he gets killed, and then he starts talking about another guy, and then he gets killed, and I'm just like, I'm going to go crazy. Like all these, like they're like 16, 17.
Too
and
much.
I'm just like, what are you like? Oh my God. Like you get crazy after a while. So I was like, no, I'm going to go just like pause for a minute. And then it's been like 3 months. So
I mean, understandable. Especially because they're such a young, like teenagers. Yeah. I think it's even in Korea, because I don't think now we have like gangs that like general public knows about, but it's more in the sense that younger kids are just becoming in group and doing some violence or other things, something that's just not they're supposed to do, but it's always younger kids. And from what I've seen and heard from them when I was in middle school in Korea, is that their parents are just not interacting with their kids. They're more neglected, like generally in their life, that they're just free to do whatever, that they feel empty. So that's why they're always hanging out in these groups, and they're trying to find some kind of emotional breakage, emotional actions they can do that actually they can feel something. And it always comes out in violence. Reading in books like this that are actually like in result that they're dying, it's really just too much, I think.
Yeah, no, I think it's gotten too far, and it's become a huge social problem, and they don't really know how to really solve it. because they need to go deeper than like just putting them in prisons, and they were in there for like 3-4 years, and they come out and they continue just the same, like right where they're left off. There's one point they talk about how they put like the leaders of the gangs in prison for once they'd all been in prison, and they all like got happy, and even he states like they didn't know that this was just the beginning, because like when they got out, gangs just got bigger, because it's just like such a short solution to putting them in prison.
There's no like therapy or
exactly, like it's a very short solution to things. You need to go deeper, look at this like social problems of why they do this, because it's not just of them go around doing this for fun, which some of them maybe are, but a lot of them are not. Some of them are there for like the money because they need it, and it's faster and easier somehow. And like you said, Sarah, as well, I think he talks about how many of these guys come from families of like maybe 6-7 children and stuff, and they need to just like get by, and some of them maybe are neglected, and because like a lot of them live in like very small apartments. I think one of them, he stated that slept by the door of the apartment, like they don't even really have places to like sleep in, like in the way they should. So I think it's just like a lot of things that accumulate into like them just like exploding and just
I can only say to Sweden is please don't take America's war on crime approach. It didn't work. It's not working.
It does not
work. You know, our prison system is just another form of slavery, and you know, it doesn't work.
No, it does not. But in that sense, I think Sweden is quite good that their prisons are like a place for rehabilitation. Like that's what they say, like most of them. And they're like, the food is good, and like the places they sleep in, like they have rooms and stuff, and they have stuff to do and plays, and like they have so much they can do. And I know because my friend worked as a prison guard, and she works with young people.
Baffling to America. And it's like, no, this is what we mean when we talk about rehabilitation, not prison, you know.
Exactly. And it's like after a while, she talks about how they can even go out to places, a mall, for example, for a day, and they come back. And after a while, their safety level gets lower, and they can stay at a house or whatever outside, because they need to start being integrated into society again. So it's like levels of them doing things to actually help them. So it's not just like isolating them, and when they come out, they don't know anything about like the world, which is insane to me. Like, of course, they need to be integrated back somehow, and they have like courses they can take, and I know from a friend that works with young people, so I think it's up to like 22-year-olds maybe she works with. And I know like obviously there are really bad prison guards, like there are in every other like occupation, but I know like she does a lot of good work. She talks with them, she makes them open up, and like they'll say like they've never talked about these things with anyone before. Like there's so much that you can actually do to make them, I don't know, just like talk to them like human beings and not just like numbers. I think most of them also like they don't really know how to express themselves in a way as well, which makes it really hard.
Awesome. That's a great recommendation.
Yeah.
I'm excited to get it.
Yeah, I think it's a very good read. I think it's hard because also it talks about like real people. Like I can read about rough things, but this is actual people have gone through all this. So I think it makes it a lot harder to like get through for me because it's so real and so close. Yeah.
But I think it's such a good, you know, if everyone read it, they would interpret those news stories in a wholly different way and call for change in a different way versus having that wall up and being like, I just see it through a screen. I don't know their names. I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. You get a lot closer.
Why they're doing it, or, you know, it's such a softening that needs to happen.
Definitely. It definitely does.
Have you seen, thinking Zeta, two different movies that aren't quite, the first one I thought of was Green Street Hooligans.
Yeah, I know that one.
It's a great one. I remember seeing it in college, and it's not quite the same gang activity as like what we're talking about in Sweden or America, but it's basically like the gangs that form around football clubs in England, in Britain. And it's an incredible movie. Elijah Wood's in it. It is very violent and painful, but it's that same kind of thing of like you get to understand these humans and the lives that they're leading and why they're doing what they're doing, and like why football is the catalyst, you know, to be like, hey, this is what we can say we're about and whatnot. But it's a really good.
I thought you were gonna talk about Furiosa. When you said hooligans, I was like, it's a very similar. Yeah,
it is absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was like, very similar. Yeah.
Oh, very. Yeah, that weird. Like you just find something that you can connect to, whether you know, sports team or whatnot. It just creates a new culture. It's so crazy. And then the second one, thinking of like people re-entering society, is always Shawshank Redemption for me.
Yeah.
Just such a beautiful and powerful movie. But yeah, I always think of Red, and just not being able to function in a society where you're not being told what to do every second of the day, which is such a real thing, especially
it's
here.
Such a different way, like the opposite of how society works or how we work as an adult as well. And then you go into prison and it's just like the smallest things of like, no, you can't do that. And they're like, why? And they're like, just because. Sometimes it's just because.
I'm powerful. You're not.
Yeah, exactly. And I remember my friend that works at the like as a prison guard told me an example of that, and how like a guy had wanted something and another prison guard had said like no, and they'd been like, why? And he's like, no, I said no, then it's no. And they'd gotten mad and started arguing, and then you start like, you can get a warning and stuff for that. And then my friend had talked to him, and she's like, what's the problem? He's like, he just said no, like I would need to know why. And she'd actually said like, I'm sorry, they should have said why. This is the reason why, just so you know. And like, you need to give a reason for things you say no to. You can't just say no because it's no. Like they're adults. They've lived outside society as well. They've been like independent and stuff. You can't just like say no to them for nothing. Like
it's not because I said so moment.
Yeah.
Sarah, are you next?
Well, I have a book that I also haven't finished yet. But and it's not as dark as yours, thank God. It's not as dark, but it's because the motive of writing this book for the author is pretty dark. That's why I said my theme in general is a bit emotional. It's a book called Crying in H Mart by Michelle Donner. So she's a Korean American. She wrote this book basically after her mom passed away. So the title explains everything technically, where every time she goes to H Mart, which is a Korean supermarket that you normally see in United States, and whenever she goes there, everything reminds her of her mom and her aunt, who both passed away due to their cancer. It's about her trying to figure out her identity of her cultural heritage, having multiple culture, and well, just not having her mom with her, and just very emotional stories of her just crying in H Mart, which she talks about these things that she shared with her mom. Sometimes it's really sweet, sometimes it's really tough, in a sense that her mom was a really tough mom in general. It's the type of person that's really, I'd say it's a very traditional Korean mom who's also very emotionally not available, that she just says everything. It's a lot of criticism and everything that for the author who grew up outside of Korea doesn't really understand as much as for me. When I'm reading it, I know what her mom meant. And for me, some of these memories that she's sharing with the readers, for me, it's a sweet memory. Because I share the same memory with my family when I'm in Korea. It's the same thing that every Korean kid experiences in their life, whether they're in Korea or outside of Korea, when they have a Korean parent. So for me, it's a very nostalgic, it's sweet. Sometimes when I'm reading this book, I'm like, oh, I forgot about this. This is nice. And then later on, she's like, yeah, but this was really hard for me. I did not understand. And all those things that she had to really work through her life and identity to understand what her mom's perspective was. When for me, it's easy. So it was really, for me, when I'm reading it, made me cry so much, was that it's such a little thing that makes her think about her mom. And for me, it's such a small thing that I'm like, oh, I don't think I think about it a lot, but she explains it so well that I think if anyone who's going through this or even is curious about Korean culture or Korean American culture, this is a great book in general. She talks about how for Koreans, food is not just food, and it's about connection they have with people. And she talks about how jealous she is when she's at H Mart or these Korean restaurants and seeing these kids with their parents and these interactions they're having while eating food, and she's just sitting there alone, and she's thinking about all these things and thinking, why do they get to experience this when I can't? And it's such an emotional book that I like you said with your book, Sedef, that sometimes I can't really go on with it as much as I want to, because it just hits that right spot. Even when I'm talking about this, I'm really trying not to cry, because it's such a little thing, isn't it? Just eating like dumplings and stuff, and she's like, "Oh, mom used to do this." And one of the parts she talks about, "Oh, I saw this boy eating this soup with their mom, and obviously they're like in 20s, but for their mom, they're still a baby." So the mom is still trying to tell him, "Oh, put this in there, do this, eat this in this way, do this to eat it." And the kid obviously is just like, "Oh, mom, I know how to eat this." But for her, now that she lost her mom, that it's like, I want that. Even though when she's talking about her mom, it's clear that she struggled with connecting with her mom, and obviously her mom the same way with her. But still, even with that relationship, she still misses her so much, and it's such a nice story. And because one of the stories, I'm just telling you like a bunch of stories that I see, but these are such a great parts that I'm just like, I never thought about this, because obviously for me, I always have my parents with me when I'm moving outside of Korea, that I don't think much about this. But for her, Korea is home, but not the same way as America. That it's a home in a sense that she sees her mom in a different way. Her mom's personality, her mom's behavior changes, because when in America, her mom's personality is that she has to control everything. Like, she cleans a lot, she has these rules, but when she goes back to Korea with her, she's like a kid again. At late night, they're having like midnight snacks and all those things, and like chatting while everyone's sleeping, and where like grandparents are all sleeping, they're in the living room sleeping together. It's a memory that I have, but at the same time very different emotions, because obviously my parents are always the same for me, because they're the default setting for me, when for her the location is default setting for her. Thank you for listening to Culture Week. We had such a wonderful time talking about books, movies, and podcasts that we ran over time. Please join us next week as we continue our conversation.